There are moments when everything you've built, every reputation carefully restored, every relationship patiently mended, hangs on the edge of a single sip. For Evans Martins, that moment arrived on a Tuesday evening in October. 60 floors above the city, he'd spent 2 years learning to serve instead of just profit from. The Martins Reserve Cabernet No. 7 wasn't just wine. It was proof that a man could stumble, learn, and rise without losing his soul. And the girl who saved his life that night? She was the daughter of the woman who'd once saved it in a quieter way, by reminding him, in the aftermath of his wife's death, that kindness was the only currency that mattered. Before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I trust you have done that. Now, let's begin. And at the heart of this carefully orchestrated evening was Evans Martins himself. He was not a billionaire who ruled from behind mahogany doors and proxy votes. He was the architect of his own comeback, a man who had learned that survival in the public eye required both control and the appearance of humility. His late wife's battle with cancer had softened his edges 5 years ago, teaching him that power without compassion was just noise. Since then, he had built something different: eco-smart hotels that employed local communities, profit-sharing models that made headlines, a reputation for listening before deciding. His benevolence was not theater. It was strategy born from grief, and it worked. That morning, before the chaos of final preparations, Evans had walked the service corridors with only his head of security. He stopped to ask Carlos, the oldest porter, about his grandson's surgery, remembering the date without notes. He noticed a flickering bulb above the loading dock and made a voice note to have maintenance upgrade the entire safety lighting system. He saw 2 junior chefs arguing in the corner near the freight elevator, and instead of summoning HR, he stepped between them, listened to both sides, and suggested a solution so practical both nodded in grudging agreement. This was his power. He did not demand loyalty through fear. He earned it daily, one unseeable gesture at a time. His company had become a case study in ethical capitalism, and tonight, the investors and journalists gathered on the 60th floor would witness the symbolic pinnacle: a man who had stumbled, rebuilt, and was now pouring the wine that proved he could be trusted again. Before we continue, let me know in the comments what industry you work in. Have you ever witnessed someone sabotage a leader from the inside? But a light as bright as Evans Martins will always cast a long, calculated shadow. And in the gleaming corridors of Martins Tower, that shadow had a name: Victor Hale. He was the house manager, a man whose resume read like a masterclass in discretion and efficiency. In public, he was Evans's most dependable operator, the one who ensured every napkin folded into geometric perfection, every vendor vetted 3 times, every guest's dietary restriction anticipated before they arrived. He stood in staff meetings with a leather portfolio and a patient smile, always deferring to Evans's vision, always 2 steps ahead of chaos. But behind his well-groomed beard and charcoal suit, behind his courteous nods and seamless execution, lay a mind consumed by bitter, corroding envy. Victor had believed, no, he had known, that when Martin's hospitality went public, he would be named Chief Operating Officer. He had spent 7 years building the systems that made Evans look like a genius. The staffing models, the vendor networks, the crisis protocols that had saved the company during the lawsuit, those were Victor's blueprints. But when the announcement came, Evans had promoted an outsider, a woman with an MBA from Wharton, and no feel for the soul of the operation. The board applauded. Victor had smiled and sent a congratulatory email. Inside, something cracked and never healed. His resentment had festered quietly for 2 years, and now it was ready to bear fruit. The Cabernet No. 7 unveiling, a night of celebration for the company, was for Victor an opportunity. He had been planning in silence, cultivating a small network of disgruntled allies who shared his hunger for control. His most crucial partner was the guest sommelier hired for the evening, a woman with impeccable credentials and a predator's instinct for survival. And Victor had one more asset: access to people who could engineer the unthinkable. The night before the grand tasting, Victor met a contact in the underground parking garage of a medical supply warehouse across the city. The man handed him a small black case, no bigger than an eyeglass holder. "Is it ready?" Victor asked, his voice low and smooth, practiced in the art of sounding reasonable. The man opened the case. Inside, cushioned in foam, lay a micro-needle cartridge the width of a pinhead, and beside it, a tiny sealed ampule filled with clear liquid. "As you requested," the man said quietly. "The cartridge seats inside the rim of any standard crystal goblet. When the drinker's lip makes contact, the needle releases aconitine, a botanical alkaloid, dose-controlled, nearly impossible to trace in the acute phase. It presents as sudden cardiac arrhythmia. The medical examiner will call it a massive heart attack brought on by stress. No one will look further." Victor took the case, his pulse steady, his hands certain. "And the antidote?" The man tapped the ampule. "This. It has to be administered within 12 hours, or the cascade is irreversible. After that, nothing can stop it." Victor's plan was elegant and brutal. During the ceremonial toast, Evans would lift the doctored goblet. The crowd would applaud. Cameras would capture the moment. Within 20 minutes, Evans would feel the first flutter in his chest. By midnight, he would collapse. By morning, the board would be in crisis mode, and Victor, the grieving, loyal house manager, would step forward. He had already drafted the memo. "For operational continuity, I recommend we activate the emergency succession protocol." The board would appoint him interim COO. Once he controlled the infrastructure, Evans's naming rights, his partnerships, his entire legacy would become Victor's portfolio to reshape or dismantle. And the young PR director Evans had been mentoring? She'd be gone within a month. But in the vast machinery of a 60-story tower, there are always eyes and ears in the places the powerful forget to look. And in the service corridors behind the Sky Lounge, moving through the controlled chaos of the evening's final preparations, was a 15-year-old girl named Susan. Susan was the daughter of Mercy, the head housemaid, a woman who had worked for Evans Martins for nearly a decade. Susan had no official role in the company. She wasn't staff, wasn't a guest, wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the executive floor. But Mercy had been given quiet permission to bring her daughter to the tower that evening. A small grace Evans had extended because he knew Mercy had no one else to watch the girl. Susan's world was one of permission slips and conditional access, of standing just outside the velvet ropes, watching the kind of wealth and power her mother served but never possessed. She was small for her age, quiet by necessity. A girl who had learned that survival in spaces like this meant being invisible. She moved through the tower on her errands, carrying folded linens, refilling ice bins, restocking the corridor beverage station, a shadow in a modest tan dress. And because no one with power ever looked at her directly, she saw and heard everything. Susan's life was a careful routine of homework in break rooms and silence during service hours. But there was one bright thread running through it, her deep, unspoken gratitude to Evans Martins. Months ago, her mother had been reprimanded by a prior house manager for bringing Susan to work during a school holiday. The manager had been harsh, public, demeaning. Evans had been walking past and stopped. He had quietly overruled the manager, asked Susan her name, and then asked what she was studying. When she stammered something about robotics, he'd smiled and said, "We'll fix that." And 2 weeks later, her mother received an envelope with a paid registration to a competitive after-school robotics program across the city. No announcement, no fanfare, just a door opened. That small act, that single moment of seeing her as something other than an inconvenience, had forged a loyalty in Susan's heart, as unshakable as steel. That night, the night of Victor's final preparations, Susan was kneeling near the service bar, adjacent to the Sky Lounge, refilling cocktail napkin dispensers. It was a part of the floor she wasn't supposed to linger in, but a spill had been reported, and she'd been sent with cleaning supplies. She was hidden behind a chrome serving cart when she saw two figures meet in the narrow corridor that connected the service kitchen to the tasting floor: Victor Hale and the guest sommelier. Susan froze, instinct telling her to stay invisible. She couldn't hear every word, just low, urgent whispers, but she heard enough. She heard Victor's smooth voice say, "He drinks from the center goblet first, the one with the Martins crest etched on the base." She heard the sommelier's clipped reply, "Once it's in his system, it looks like natural cardiac failure. No one will question it." And she heard Victor's final instruction, cold and certain. "By morning, the company will need new leadership." She watched, heart hammering, as the sommelier slipped something small and dark into Victor's palm. A transaction in shadows. A secret that smelled like death. Susan was paralyzed. She knew something terrible was about to happen. But what could she do? Who would believe her? A housemaid's daughter, 15 years old, no credentials, no standing, accusing the house manager and a renowned wine expert of conspiracy? She'd be dismissed as confused, attention-seeking, troublemaking. She could destroy her mother's job. She could ruin everything. But she also knew one truth with absolute clarity. Evans Martins had seen her when no one else did. And she would not let him die. The next evening, the Sky Lounge filled with the hum of wealth and expectation. Investors in tailored suits, journalists with cameras, board members whose smiles were sharp as credit ratings. Soft jazz drifted through the sound system. The city stretched beyond the glass like a glittering empire. Evans stood near the central table, resplendent in a navy suit, his expression calm, his posture that of a man who had fought his way back to solid ground. Beside him, Victor Hale stood with his leather portfolio, his face a perfect mask of professional devotion. Susan had slipped away from the service kitchen, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. Mercy had told her to stay in the back, to keep out of sight. But Susan pushed through the auxiliary door and edged along the wall, her eyes locked on the center of the gleaming walnut table where a single crystal decanter sat, surrounded by a ring of pristine goblets. The moment she had been dreading arrived. The guest sommelier stepped forward, elegant and poised, carrying a silver tray. On it sat one goblet, the one with the Martins crest etched faintly into the base. The sommelier lifted it with ceremonial precision, filled it halfway with the deep red Cabernet, and turned toward Evans. The room quieted. Cameras angled. The skyline watched. Evans reached for the goblet, and Susan saw it. Just for a flash, when the crystal tilted toward the pendant lights. a faint metallic glint along the inner rim, a crescent of something that did not belong. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Never disrupt the floor. Never break the line. Susan broke it anyway. She lunged forward, dodging a server, slipping past a journalist, her hand outstretched. She grabbed Evans's sleeve just as his fingers closed around the stem. "Mr. Martins," she gasped, her voice cracking with fear and certainty. "Please, don't drink the wine." The room inhaled as one. Every head turned. The sommelier froze mid-step. Victor's face went pale, then smooth again, but not fast enough. And Evans Martins, who owed this girl and her mother more than the room would ever know, looked into Susan's terrified eyes and made a choice. He trusted the smallest voice in the room. But to understand why Evans Martins listened to a 15-year-old girl instead of dismissing her as confused or disruptive, you have to go back. Back to the grief that rebuilt him. Back to the housekeeper who became his anchor. Back to the fire that bound their families long before this night. Back to the day Evans learned that the people who save your life don't always wear uniforms or carry credentials. Sometimes they just carry quiet courage and a memory of kindness you've forgotten you gave. Let me show you how 3 lives became knotted together by loss, loyalty, and a single act of grace that no one was supposed to notice. Evans didn't lower the goblet. He held it suspended between them, crystal catching light, wine dark as a bruise, and turned to Rami, his head of security, who was already moving toward the table. "Bring the loop," Evans said quietly. "The one we keep for authentication checks." Rami returned in seconds with a compact magnifying device, the kind used to verify signatures on contracts and detect counterfeit labels. Evans set the goblet down with deliberate care, positioning it beneath the pendant light. Guests leaned forward. Journalists raised cameras. Victor stood motionless, his expression frozen somewhere between concern and calculation. Rami angled the loop over the goblet's rim, adjusting the focus. For 3 seconds, there was only the hum of the ventilation system and the distant pulse of the city below. Then Rami's jaw tightened. "Sir, you need to see this." Evans looked. The magnified image revealed a hairline seam along the inner curve of the crystal, almost invisible to the naked eye, a crescent-shaped housing no wider than a thread. Embedded inside was something metallic, surgical, a micro-needle cartridge, seated flush with the glass. "It's engineered," Rami said, his voice low and controlled. "Spring-loaded, pressure-activated. The moment liquid makes contact with the drinker's lip, the needle deploys. Delivers a dose directly into the mucous membrane." A woman near the window gasped. One of the board members stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Evans straightened, his face unreadable. He turned to the guest sommelier, who had taken one small step backward, her poise beginning to fracture. "You poured this wine," Evans said evenly. "You selected this glass, so I think it's only appropriate." He lifted the goblet and extended it toward her. "That you take the first sip." The sommelier's hand rose halfway, then froze. Her fingers trembled. The room watched her the way an audience watches a tightrope walker lose balance. There are protocols," she stammered. "Tasting order, cellar standards." "Then explain the protocols," Evans interrupted, his tone still calm, still courteous, but edged now with something colder. "Explain why you would hand me a glass with a concealed needle cartridge." Her composure shattered. She looked toward Victor, a flash of panic, of betrayal, of calculation collapsing under scrutiny. Rami moved smoothly to her side, his hand light on her elbow, guiding her away from the table and toward the private corridor that led to the service exit. "No one leaves," Evans said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Rami, secure the doors. All glassware goes into evidence bags. I want the guest list cross-referenced with entry logs." Mercy had been standing near the auxiliary door, her hands folded, her face composed in the mask of invisibility that service workers learn to wear. But her mind was racing, replaying the past 3 weeks in rapid sequence. She stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. "Mr. Martins, if I may." Evans turned. "Mercy, there were extra deliveries," she said. "Victor signed for stemware replacements 2 weeks ago, out of cycle. We don't replace glassware until the quarterly inventory, but he said it was a special request for tonight. The vendor name was one I didn't recognize, a shell address in Delaware. I flagged it in my log." Evans's gaze shifted to Victor, who stood perfectly still, his face now the careful blank of a man trying to decide which lie would hold longest. Susan, still standing near her mother, spoke suddenly. "He pocketed a vial." Every head turned. "In the corridor last night," Susan continued, her voice steadier now, "I saw him meet the sommelier. She handed him something small, a glass vial. He put it in his jacket pocket." Rami didn't wait for Evans's signal. He moved to Victor, whose expression finally cracked, not into panic, but into something harder, something defiant. Rami's hand went to Victor's jacket, and when it emerged, it held a thumb-sized ampule filled with clear liquid. The label was clinical, precise. Atropine sulfate, antiarrhythmic, emergency use only. "No one carries an antidote to an accident," Rami said quietly. The room seemed to contract, the air thinner, the skyline suddenly too bright. One of the board members, Marcus, the CFO Evans had promoted a year earlier, stepped forward, his face grim. "Evans, I need to show you something." Marcus pulled his tablet from his briefcase, fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Accounting flagged this an hour ago. I was going to bring it to you after the toast." He turned the screen. 3 wire transfers 72 hours ago. Total 2.3 million, routed through a consultant shell to an offshore account. Evans scanned the routing codes, the timestamps, the memo line that simply read, "Project Succession." "There's more," Marcus said, his voice tight. "An emergency board memo was drafted this morning, filed but not distributed. It recommends activating the key person clause if you become incapacitated. Names Victor's external consultant as interim COO, pending board vote." He paused. "It's time-stamped for 9:15 tonight." 15 minutes after the toast. Evans looked at Victor, whose jaw was locked, whose hands were clenched, whose entire body radiated the fury of a plan unraveling in real time. "You built this carefully," Evans said softly. "Poison in the glass. Antidote in your pocket. Money transferred. Memo drafted. You even timed it to the minute." Victor said nothing. "Rami, call the police," Evans said, "and get me every frame of security footage from the loading dock, the service corridors, and this floor for the past 72 hours. As Rami moved toward the exit, his phone already to his ear, the room exhaled, a slow, shuddering release of tension that left everyone feeling unmoored. Evans turned back to the table, to the goblet still sitting beneath the light, its secret now exposed. He looked at Susan, then at Mercy, and something in his expression softened. "You saved my life tonight," he said quietly. "Both of you." Mercy's hand found Susan's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the city glittered, indifferent and eternal. Inside, the glass cathedral had become a crime scene. Elegance dissolved into evidence, and the smallest voice in the room had rewritten everything. The police arrived in pairs, methodical, efficient, transforming the Sky Lounge into a grid of evidence markers and hushed procedural language. But before the detectives could take control, Rami had already begun his own excavation. He stood at the secondary security station, pulling footage from 6 different angles, his fingers moving across the touch screen with surgical precision. Evans watched over his shoulder, his face carved from stone. Marcus stood beside them, tablet in hand, already cross-referencing timestamps. "There," Rami said, freezing the frame. "Loading dock, 4:47 p.m. The image showed an outside courier, unmarked van, generic uniform, face obscured by a cap, entering through the service bay. He carried a single box marked Replacement Stemware, Rush Delivery. He bypassed the main receiving desk, Rami continued, advancing the footage. Went straight to the service elevator. Victor met him on 32. The next frame showed Victor accepting the box, signing something on a tablet, and the courier leaving. No inventory check, no secondary verification. Just a handoff in a corridor, no one was watching. "Rewind to this morning," Evans said quietly. "Kitchen prep." Rami complied. The footage jumped to 9:15 a.m., the service bar being set up for the evening. A staff member, one of the bartenders Evans recognized, arranged stemware in neat rows. All standard crystal, all identical. "Now jump to 5:30, Evans instructed. At 5:30 p.m., Victor appeared alone. He approached the center of the arrangement, lifted one goblet, examined it briefly, and replaced it with another from the box he'd received. The swap took 11 seconds. Then he carried the original glass away, disappearing into the corridor that led to the waste management chute. "He disposed of the evidence before anyone could compare," Marcus said. "Clean substitution." Evans turned to Rami. "Pull the vendor records. I want to know where that glass came from." It took Marcus less than 10 minutes. His accounting team had already been digging, and the threads were beginning to surface. He returned with a printout, his expression grim. "The stemware was sourced through a medical tech intermediary called Vanguard Biosupply," Marcus said. "They specialize in transdermal delivery systems, lab equipment for pharmaceutical trials. I cross-referenced the micro-cartridge specs with patent filings. It's a match for a prototype designed for subcutaneous medication delivery. Experimental, never FDA approved for clinical use." "And the connection to Victor?" Evans asked. "The purchase order was placed by the same consultant shell that received the wire transfers," Marcus replied. "All roads lead back to the same offshore account. Victor didn't just plan this, he financed it." In the private holding room adjacent to the lounge, the guest sommelier sat with her hands folded on the table, her earlier poise completely disintegrated. Detective Chen, the lead investigator, sat across from her. Rami stood near the door. Evans had chosen to observe through the one-way glass, Mercy beside him. "Walk me through how you were hired," Chen said, her tone flat, procedural. The sommelier's voice was thin, unsteady. "I received a call 3 weeks ago. A staffing agency, Viridi Staff Solutions. They said Martin's Hospitality needed a specialist for a high-profile launch. The pay was triple the standard rate, all cash, no questions." "And the protocols?" Chen asked. "They told me the host drinks first from a designated goblet," the sommelier said, her hands now trembling. "It was described as a tradition, ceremonial precedent. I was told not to deviate. They said if I followed the script exactly, there'd be a performance bonus. Who briefed you on the script? Victor Hale. Her voice cracked. He walked me through everything yesterday. He said Evans Martins was particular about presentation, that the center goblet was custom-etched, a keepsake piece. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. Then why didn't you drink when he asked you to? Chen cut in. The sommelier looked down. Because I saw his face, and I knew something was wrong. Victor sat in the second holding room, flanked by Rami's team. His lawyer had been called, but hadn't yet arrived. Evans entered alone, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the table, his presence filling the small room like pressure before a storm. You want to explain this to me? Evans said, his voice dangerously quiet. Victor leaned back, arms crossed. I don't know what you're talking about. That sommelier was hired through standard channels. If she brought compromised equipment, that's on her vendor. The wire transfers came from company accounts you controlled, Evans said. Consultant fees, legitimate business expenses. The emergency succession memo. Victor's eyes flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough. That's standard fiduciary procedure. We're required to have contingency protocols for any key person event. Key person event? Evans repeated slowly. That's an insurance term. Specific language. The kind of language only someone drafting the policy would use. Victor's jaw tightened. You wrote that memo, Evans continued. You knew the exact timing because you engineered it. Victor's mask finally cracked. You don't deserve what you have, he hissed. I built the systems that made you look competent. I cleaned up every mess you made during the lawsuit. I saved this company while you were playing grief-stricken philanthropist. And when it was time to recognize that work, you gave my job to someone who'd never stepped foot in a kitchen. So you tried to kill me. I tried to take what should have been mine. Mercy stood in the corridor, outside the holding rooms, her mind assembling the final pieces. She had spent a decade watching the invisible machinery of power, learning to read the margins. She pulled her phone from her pocket and scrolled through her log. A private record she kept of anomalies, the kind of details that didn't merit reports but always nagged at her instincts. She found it. 3 weeks ago. Insurance broker visit, unscheduled, Victor present. Key person clause amendment rushed through legal. 2 weeks ago. Tasting date moved forward by 6 days. Victor's request. Cited optimal PR window. 1 week ago, PR team briefed on leadership transition narrative. Flagged as premature by junior associate. Overruled by Victor. She walked to Evans, who was exiting Victor's interrogation, and handed him the phone without a word. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. He didn't just plan to kill me, Evans said quietly. He planned the aftermath. Press release, board memo, insurance claim. He built a whole empire on my death. Before Mercy could respond, a commotion erupted near the service corridor. Victor had lunged for the exit, breaking past one officer, his movements desperate and feral. Rami's team converged. Victor twisted, reaching for the door handle. And in the scuffle, the antidote vial slipped from his jacket pocket and shattered against the marble floor. The sound, sharp, final, silenced the room. Victor stared at the spreading pool of clear liquid, his face pale. Everyone understood the symbolism. The only safeguard against the poison he'd deployed, now destroyed. If Evans had drunk from that glass, there would be no second chances. Rami hauled Victor upright, cuffing him with controlled precision. You're done. As the police led Victor away, Susan stood near the window, her hand in her pocket, fingers worrying the edges of something small and worn. Mercy noticed, moved beside her daughter, and whispered, "Not now." Susan's hand stilled. Evans saw the exchange but didn't ask. Not yet. Outside, the first sirens began to fade, and the city resumed its indifferent rhythm. Inside, the truth had been assembled, piece by brutal piece, and the smallest voice in the room had set it all in motion. The guests had been escorted out in controlled waves, statements taken, contact information logged, reassurances offered in the language of corporate crisis management. The journalists had been corralled by PR, their cameras confiscated pending investigation clearance. The Sky Lounge, once a cathedral of ambition, now felt hollow, its elegance stripped down to the skeleton of what had almost happened. Evans found himself walking the service corridors, past the gleaming appliances and stainless steel prep stations, following the sound of quiet voices toward the staff kitchen. It was a room he rarely entered, the operational heart of his tower, where the people who made his life possible gathered between shifts to eat quickly and rest briefly before returning to invisible labor. Mercy sat at the corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Susan was beside her, still in her tan dress, her expression older now, marked by the weight of what she'd witnessed. Around them, a handful of staff members spoke in low tones, their faces drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from holding fear at bay for hours. When Evans entered, the room quieted. He didn't retreat. He pulled out a chair across from Mercy and Susan and sat, meeting their eyes without the buffer of hierarchy or distance. "Susan," he said, his voice steady but soft, "I need everyone here to know what you did tonight." Susan looked down at her hands. "You broke protocol," Evans continued. "You disrupted a room full of powerful people. You risked your mother's job. You risked being wrong in front of everyone who matters in this building." He paused. "And you saved my life." The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the industrial refrigerator. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Evans said, "but I can start by saying this in front of witnesses. You didn't just stop a murder. You showed me that the rules we build to protect order sometimes blind us to the truth, and the people we overlook are often the ones who see most clearly." Mercy's hand found Susan's, squeezing gently. Susan looked up, her voice quiet but certain. "My mom always said rules protect people. But tonight I realized—" She hesitated, searching for words. "Sometimes rules protect the wrong things, and when that happens, you have to choose what matters more." Evans nodded slowly. "You chose right." There was a beat of silence, fragile and full. Then Susan reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around something she'd carried all evening. She pulled it out and set it on the steel table between them. A dog tag. Scuffed, worn at the edges, the engraving still legible. Chinedu Okoye. Evans went completely still. The air seemed to leave the room. He stared at the name, his face draining of color, his hands frozen halfway to the table. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper. Mercy spoke, her tone steady despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "It was my husband's." Evans looked up sharply. "Chinedu Okoye was your husband?" She nodded. "He was a safety engineer, contract work, mostly, construction sites, industrial facilities. 10 years ago, he was assigned to your warehouse expansion project in Newark." Her voice wavered, but held. "There was a fire, faulty wiring in the temporary office trailer. He got you out. dragged you through smoke and rebar while the stairwell collapsed behind you. Evans closed his eyes, and the memory hit him like a freight train. Heat, smoke, the sound of metal groaning, and a man's voice shouting, "Move! Move! Keep moving!" while strong hands pulled him forward. He'd woken in the hospital with second-degree burns and a concussion. When he asked for the name of the man who saved him, the site supervisor had said, "Chinedu Okoye." He didn't make it out. "I searched for his family," Evans said hoarsely. "I set up a trust. Anonymous. I didn't have names, just next of kin through the insurance paperwork. I've been funding it for 10 years. Mercy's breath caught. "The trust with the education account and the housing stipend? That was you?" She nodded, tears spilling now. "I didn't know. The lawyer said it was from a benefactor. No name. I thought maybe it was from the construction company. Guilt money. I took the job here a year after Chinedu died because the insurance had lapsed and I needed stability. I never told you who I was because," her voice broke, "because I didn't want charity. I wanted to stand on my own. I wanted to earn what I had." Evans reached across the table and placed both hands over the dog tag, as if it were something sacred. "You've been here for 9 years." 9 years, Mercy confirmed. "And I never knew." He looked at Susan. "I never connected it." Susan spoke quietly. "My dad used to say that good people don't save lives for credit. They do it because it's right. And I think—" She glanced at her mother. "I think Mom believed the same thing. That working here wasn't about who she was before. It was about who she chose to be." Evans felt something crack open in his chest. Grief, gratitude, the weight of debts invisible and unpayable. "Chinedu saved my life. And tonight, his daughter saved it again." He looked around the kitchen, at the staff watching in silence, and made a decision that had been forming since the moment Susan grabbed his sleeve. "I'm not going to turn this into a circus," he said. "No press conference painting me as a victim, no media spectacle. Victor will be prosecuted, the conspiracy will be dismantled. But the story I'm going to tell," he looked at Mercy, then Susan, "is about what failed, about how I built a system that let someone like Victor get close enough to try this, about how the people I trusted most weren't the ones in boardrooms." Mercy shook her head. "Evans, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he said firmly, "because this isn't just about justice. It's about making sure it never happens again. And that starts with me changing how power works in this building." Before Mercy could respond, Evans's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Board counsel. He answered on speaker. "Evans, we have a problem," the lawyer said, his voice tight. "Media has the story. They're already running with it. Some are asking if you staged the whole thing, a sympathetic narrative to distract from the lawsuit settlement last year." Evans' jaw tightened. He looked at Mercy, at Susan, at the dog tag still sitting between them like a bridge across grief and time. "Then we'll show them the whole truth," Evans said, his voice calm and absolute. "And what comes next?" He ended the call, and in the fluorescent hum of the staff kitchen, surrounded by the people who had held his world together while he learned to rebuild it, Evans Martins made a promise. Tomorrow, everything changes. The press conference was held the next afternoon in the Sky Lounge. The same room, the same table, but stripped of its ceremonial gloss. No wine, no staged lighting. Just Evans Martins standing at the head of the table with Mercy and Susan seated beside him, and 24 journalists watching with the alertness of people who knew they were witnessing something rare. a billionaire choosing transparency over spin. Evans didn't read from notes. He spoke plainly, his voice steady as he explained the microneedle cartridge, the embezzlement scheme, the emergency succession memo timed to the minute. He was named Victor Hale. He named the co-conspirators. He held up the evidence bag containing the shattered goblet and let the cameras zoom in on the device that had been designed to end his life. And then he did something no one expected. The person who saved me wasn't security, Evans said. It wasn't the board. It was a 15-year-old girl named Susan Okoye, the daughter of my head housemaid, Mercy Okoye. Susan saw what everyone else missed, because she was standing where powerful people forget to look. He turned to Susan, who sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She broke every rule she'd been taught about staying invisible, Evans continued. And in doing so, she showed me that the systems I built to protect this company were protecting the wrong things. So today, I'm announcing changes that start at the foundation. The room leaned forward. Effective immediately, Mercy Okoye is promoted to Chief of Household and Staff Welfare, Evans said. She'll have full authority over hiring, training, vendor audits, and labor protections. No more feudal hierarchies. No more invisible workers. Staff will have anonymous reporting channels, transparent pay scales, and board observer seats to ensure their voices are heard at the highest level. Mercy's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. Evans met her gaze and nodded once, a promise made good. Second, Evans continued, I'm establishing the Chinedu Okoye Fellowship for STEM and Safety Innovation. It will provide full scholarships, paid residencies, and mentorship for young people pursuing careers in engineering, robotics, and public safety. Susan Okoye will be the first resident at Martin's Innovation Lab, where she'll be developing safety technologies to prevent what almost happened here from ever happening again. A murmur rippled through the journalists. Cameras clicked. Third, Evans said, his voice firmer now, I'm creating a permanent fund for the families of first responders, the people who run toward danger while the rest of us run away. Because 10 years ago, a man named Chinedu Okoye saved my life in a warehouse fire, and I never got to thank him. I can't bring him back, but I can honor what he stood for. He paused, letting the weight settle. Victor Hale and his co-conspirators will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But this isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about fixing what allowed them to get this close in the first place. And that responsibility starts with me. The questions came fast after that, but Evans deflected most of them, keeping the focus on systems rather than spectacle. When the cameras finally left, he turned to Mercy and Susan and said simply, Let's get to work. 3 weeks later, Mercy stood in her new office on the 45th floor. Modest but functional, with windows overlooking the city and a desk that didn't feel borrowed. She'd insisted on keeping it understated. No marble, no excess. Just a space designed for the work that mattered. In the bottom drawer of her desk, folded with care, was her old service apron. She'd kept it not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder, the woman who wore that apron had survived, had raised a daughter, had earned every step that brought her here. She wouldn't forget her. On the wall behind her desk hung a framed blueprint. The new staff protocols she'd drafted with input from every department. Fair scheduling, health benefits, pathways for advancement. It wasn't revolutionary. It was just decent. But in an industry built on invisible labor, decency was a revolution. Down the hall in the Innovation Lab, Susan sat at a workbench surrounded by circuit boards, sensors, and a row of crystal goblets. She was sketching schematics for a device she'd been obsessing over since the night of the tasting, a sensor ring that could detect foreign objects embedded in glassware. The prototype was crude, a flexible band embedded with microscanners that emitted a soft chirp when passed along the rim of a glass containing any metallic anomaly. It wasn't perfect yet. The sensitivity needed calibration. But it worked. She held it over one of the test goblets, the one embedded with a deactivated needle cartridge for comparison. The device chirped, sharp, insistent, unmistakable. Susan smiled. The legal outcomes came swiftly. Victor Hale was indicted on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, embezzlement, and fraud. The guest sommelier, in exchange for full cooperation, received a reduced sentence and probation. The medical tech intermediary lost its license. The corporate ally Evans had briefly suspected, Marcus, the CFO, proved not just loyal but instrumental, helping untangle the financial web Victor had woven. Evans offered him a seat on the board. Marcus accepted. 6 weeks after the night that almost ended everything, Evans returned to the Sky Lounge at sunset. The room had been cleaned, recertified, and quietly reopened for internal meetings. No guests, no spectacle, just a space reclaimed. Mercy and Susan joined him at the table. Evans carried a small glass case, and inside it, he carefully placed Chinedu's dog tag beside the first goblet produced under Mercy's new vendor protocols, clear, clean, and rigorously inspected. Susan set her prototype sensor ring on the table and activated it. She passed it slowly along the goblet's rim. Silence. No chirp. No hidden threat. "It works," she said softly. Evans looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, something close to peace settled over his features. "You didn't just save my life, Susan," he said. "You changed how we protect every life that walks in here. Your father pulled me out of fire. You pulled me out of something worse, complacency. The belief that I'd built something safe just because it looked polished." Susan glanced at her mother, then back at Evans. Rules protect people, but only if the people who make the rules remember why they exist. Mercy reached across the table and rested her hand on the glass case, her fingers grazing the dog tag. "Chinedu would have been proud," she said quietly, "of both of you." The city lights began to rise beyond the windows, a constellation of ambition and survival spreading across the skyline. The table gleamed, not as a stage for death, but as a bench for design, for reform, for the quiet work of making power answerable to the people it was supposed to serve. Evans stood and raised an empty glass. No wine, no ceremony, just a gesture. "To the smallest voices," he said, "and the loudest truths." Mercy and Susan lifted theirs in return. Outside, the city pulsed on, indifferent and eternal. Inside, 3 lives bound by loss and loyalty had rewritten the rules. And this time, the rules would hold.